Well, thank you very much. First of all, very impressive and thoughtful remarks by Jason just a moment ago. Let's give Jason another round of applause. Thank you, first of all, to the McCain Institute, to Evelyn Farkas, to the McCain family. And what I was thinking about when I was asked to moderate this session was how much 1 year makes in terms of what we were talking about and what we're talking about now. This was not a subject that was on the agenda last year. And this is all in Washington, and for that matter, around the country because of gas prices. This is all really anybody is talking about right now. So this is a wonderful panel. Thank you all for joining us. And I want to start out by asking each of you this question that you come to from different perspectives. And that is, and I'll start with you, General, and then I'll go to you next, Sue, and Reid, I'll follow up with you. Was this war necessary, and was this war necessary right now?
So Iran's posed a threat to the United States for many years, going back almost half a century. We're all aware of the many trials and tribulations between our two nations. I think at some point you're going to have to confront Iran. This is not necessarily a bad time to do that. But you know, really that's a political question, not a military question. I can tell you this, the Joint Force has looked at Iran for several decades. What's happening in this campaign is not something that's drawn up on the back of an envelope. When I was commander of CENTCOM for 3 years, I owned this plan. I handed it off to General Eric Kurilla, who followed me, who handed it off to Brad Cooper. So we're not doing this on the spur of the moment. We've given a lot of hard thought to this. So I would argue that's a larger question that the other people on the panel can answer. But I think Iran left uncontested has malign intent not only in the region but globally.
Sue, you come to it from a different perspective than General McKenzie does, the intelligence background. What's your view on that question?
So everything the general said, that's just a safe place to be. I would say one of the things I try and look at, a lot of people ask whether some X or Y is a good decision. Man, if I'm not in the chair and I'm not in that moment, that adjudicating goodness or badness is really hard. So what I try and think about is it a legitimate decision? And for all the reasons he said, I think doing something about Iran was a legitimate decision. From my perspective, what we're seeing now is not unexpected. What we're seeing that Iran is a patient adversary that has been around a long time, and this issue is not new. And we should have understood that the issue of eradicating their nuclear ambition is really hard. And so I'm not sure that it wasn't a fine decision to want to do it. The action has shown that we have, I think, now transition to what we could have anticipated happening, and that is the conflict isn't over, it has shifted domain, it has shifted to economic and political and with allies, and that is a really hard, much harder place to be. And my question would be, did we invest in the underpinnings of this moment? We certainly didn't with our allies. You could argue that our installed base of the professional cadre that from my perspective is there to do the how to the what of the people's elected representative is a little thin and isn't listened to as much as it might be. And then the last thing I'll say is that we're just in a world where the founder's vision of democracy and capitalism, which I will say is a tension now between speed and legitimacy, is really under strain. And speed is attractive, but legitimacy is what gives you persistence. And when I say legitimacy, it isn't the decision. It's about, do you use your systems of control with it? So, fine decision. Question about whether it could be affected in the way that we wanted.
Reid, you've written about this. Do you come to it from the same perspective?
Well, John, I think you ask an important question. Boiled down to brass tacks, was this a war of necessity? From my estimation, No, not a war of necessity. My textbook understanding of just war or a war of necessity requires meeting one of several criteria. Normally, has your country been attacked? So America goes to war in Afghanistan after 9/11 or enters the Second World War after Pearl Harbor. Has some important treaty obligation been triggered? So say Great Britain goes to the continent in the First World War after the Germans run through Belgium? Or is there some intolerable threat that is so imminent that inaction would be catastrophic? Say Israel entering the 6 Days War. So by my estimation, this particular conflict does not meet the threshold of what I would consider a war of necessity.
I think back to the Persian Gulf War of 1991, and I think back about the remarkable coalition that was put together in terms of pushing Iraq out of Kuwait. In this instance, we have a coalition, and it's a coalition of two. It's the United States and Israel. General McKenzie, are you surprised by that? And I realize you don't want to get into the politics of things, but should there be more than two countries pursuing this effort to stop Iran from developing and potentially using a nuclear weapon?
So yes, but I would argue that Iran, by its own actions, has actually made it possible for particularly countries in the region, and I'm talking about the Gulf states, to come to a position of support for our operation that maybe wasn't there when it began. In fact, I go so far as to say that Iran's decision to launch counter-value strikes against the Gulf states, particularly UAE, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and others, is the equivalent of Hitler's decision in December 1941 to declare war on the United States after Pearl Harbor. FDR had no problem mobilizing support in the United States to fight the Japanese, but the U.S. body politic was highly divided over fighting Germany. Hitler took that out of his hands by declaring war on the United States. Same case applies. Where you had cold indifference at the beginning of the war, I think you've now got something far different, particularly with our friends and allies in the region. And those are actually the most important friends and allies that we need in order to execute this campaign.
Sue, are you surprised by the reaction of Iran, what General McKenzie just mentioned, the way that Iran reacted by going after Arab countries in the region in the way that it did?
I think it was clever, necessitated, right? They had to, in fact, build a coalition. They had the advantage that we hadn't had the conversations with the American people or with the world about, to your point, why we needed to do this. And so they needed to create some counter pressure. They are in extremis, right? They do need to find a way forward. They can't survive as they are. So what they've done is they created a pressure. Now, it has certainly given us opportunity with our friends and allies, but it has also given them opportunities somehow through a combination of our actions and their actions. There's a sympathetic aspect to Iran that is giving them opportunity. So surprised, I don't know, that sounds too arrogant to say. I'm not surprised. I think it was clever. I think they have demonstrated kind of across the board more cleverness and understanding in terms of what pressure looks like. I mean, all you have to do is look at their Lego videos. And they're creepy terroristy things, but they're also massively advanced in terms of using cyber for information warfare. So I think I'm not that surprised. I think General McKenzie's point is it has a good effect and difficult effect for them.
Reid, there's this naval blockade the U.S. has put into place. It prevents any Iranian ships from going into Iranian ports or leaving Iranian ports. This is something that the president, I've asked the president so many questions about this over the course of the past 9 weeks. And this is the thing that the president believes will force Iran to capitulate. What's your view on that?
Difficult for me to say from my sort of outside observational perspective. I think Iran feels confident that they have time on their side right at the moment. And I think they think this for a number of different reasons. And that's in part because of the repercussions of this war on the domestic body politic here in the United States, right? Obviously, there are economic costs, whether at the gas pump or the grocery store. Those are the known knowns. What we don't know yet is how fertilizer shortages are going to impact American agriculture, or how helium that doesn't make it to market is going to impact semiconductor manufacturing. There are fiscal costs, right? My friend, Acting Comptroller Jay Hurst, testified in front of the Congress the other day that the war had cost about $25 billion to this point. Could be more, perhaps. There's rumor of a supplemental in the Congress, anywhere to the tune of $50 to $200 billion that might come down the pike in the not too distant future. There's some political costs as well, too, as Republicans look ahead to the midterms and consider what this might mean for majority-minority dynamics in the Congress and the actual pursuit of the president's ambitious agenda. And I also think there's this kind of peculiar cultural dimension to this as well, too. I reflect on the fact that this war is something of a distraction from a year that we might otherwise be celebrating America's 250th birthday, unencumbered by a foreign entanglement. We've got the World Cup coming up. I'd like to spend more time reflecting on, the Artemis mission that I watched in my kitchen with my two kids, our jaws on the floor. And I do feel like this feels like a distraction from things that might otherwise bring the country more closely together, which might prompt the president to decide to bring things to a close sooner, and perhaps in keeping with what the Iranians are expecting from this.
Well, General, given that the president clearly would like this conflict to end sooner rather than later, can he declare victory if one of the goals that he set out, which is preventing Iran from developing this nuclear weapons program, from potentially using nuclear weapons in the region, if that hasn't been reached, that goal hasn't been reached, how can you end this conflict?
Well, we certainly have the capability to apply more force to get to that end state if the president chooses to do it. We set them back pretty good over the course of the summer. That comes down to a presidential decision. But I would note that we do have the ability to do it. There's a level of risk associated with doing that. And by that, I mean removing all the material from Iran, should we be directed to do it. We have that capability. It would not be easy, but it is certainly possible. The Joint Force can do it. The Joint Force can also open the Strait of Hormuz. And by the Joint Force, I mean the United States, without external assistance, under one or two conditions, actually two conditions. One is the Iranians tacitly allow us to do it. The second condition is they actively oppose us. Either one we can do. The second case is obviously going to be bloody and messy, but it is also certainly achievable by the forces that are there now.
So we were talking about this just before we came out, and people sometimes, believe it or not, forget this. Donald Trump was president before. He was president for 4 years, and we were talking about how potentially he could have taken the kind of action that we're seeing the United States take right now in his first term. What are your thoughts on that?
If you go back to the summer of 2019, and one of the reasons the president was so opposed to the JCPOA, the agreement that was in place, was because it gave them a lot of money with which they could buy things. And in the summer of 19, you just saw the heyday of proxy activities all through the Middle East, right? And so that was something we were trying to counter. It was threatening our forces. It was threatening others. It felt to me that in that summer, Iran was trying to sucker us into conflict because we didn't have the coalition. Europe was not certain about whether it really wanted us to be engaged in a hot war because of their economic dependence on what was going on there. And throughout that summer, we were working with the president to see what we could do that would be effective and what we could do that wouldn't get us sucked in a way. And I think in that summer, from my perspective, it was an effective summer that ended really in the killing of Soleimani. But we didn't get as far as he wanted to go. So I think he always had those ambitions. He had a very different leadership cadre that was probably more on the side of second and third order effects, think it through. Israel has always wanted us to be engaged, so pressure from Israel was certainly engaged then, but again, it was just kind of fought off. So I think this isn't a new thought for him to do something about it. The only counter I would say is, from an intelligence perspective, to think that you can take away someone's ambitions to have the kind of power that keeps them from being at the whim of someone more powerful than them, I think is something that previous administrations came to. That's why you signed the agreement, because you thought that forestalling it was better than the other. And my worry is that resolution is going to have to be taking something less than the original agreement was, because the likelihood that even with all the military work we've done that you're going to be able to get them to give up their ambitions. But from the president's perspective, this is not a new thought to do it. He just effected it differently in 2019.
From the president's perspective, he had a very successful military mission in Venezuela.
Yes, he did.
In and out. He had achieved his objectives in less than 24 hours. Is it too simplistic a view to think that the president thought that he could have a similar type of goal reached in a short amount of time as it relates to Iran? In general, I'll have you answer that question.
So, we can all speculate on Venezuela. I actually think in President Trump's mind, when he contemplates this action, he goes back to the strike on Soleimani in January 2020, which I think is broadly underestimated in the United States of its importance across the region, and in particular, its importance in Iran. I believe that actually that strike and his decision to do it has affected Iranian decision-making to this day, thrown them off balance. They have never recovered their balance. He was their guy that could pull it all together. He had a familial relationship with the supreme leader. A lot of things that allowed him to align all the proxies in the region, but he has not been replaced. Iran has been unsuccessful in replacing him. I think actually, as President Trump examines this, certainly Venezuela, we can all speculate they may have had an effect, but I really believe the precipitating thing for the president and actually for the Iranians, you got to go back to Qasem Soleimani.
Interesting. Reid?
I might just expand on that to say, in addition to Soleimani, we have to recall the tactical success of Midnight Hammer, right?
Yes.
So there's a kind of building one upon the other aspect of this, whereby the president, I think, understandably feels nigh on invincible. And I think that he believed fundamentally this could go quickly, relatively smoothly, and he could achieve something that other presidents didn't have the wherewithal or willpower to accomplish. So I think important considerations as we're trying to diagnose how we got to this point here.
We heard something really novel from Secretary Hegseth this week during his testimony in the U.S. Senate. And what we heard is that 60 days associated with the War Powers Act and the deadline for getting an authorization for the use of force from Congress has paused. It's paused, he says, because of the ceasefire. And yet at the same time, there is a naval blockade that has been imposed upon Iran. In your view, do those two things mesh? Sue, let me ask you that question.
Yeah, I think that's convenient. We're still at war. Like I say, different domain, still at war. Still our founders' vision that these decisions are hard and they require the friction. They built the system the way we did to put that friction in, to make decision-makings hard. The Congress are the American people's representative. He is, in fact, talking to us when he talks to them. So leaning on the War Powers Act that has always been sketchily enforced is entirely different than this is big. This is a big moment. You ought to have a conversation with the American people and their representatives. So I think in general, I get it. Bureaucracy is oogie. I was part of it for so many years, and I'm sorry for every day that I was slow. I am not sorry for a single day that I raised my hand and said, have you thought about this? And so I don't think we should rest on the legal consideration whether it is legal or not. I think the question is, this isn't ending. We have the potential to have made the world worse for not only ourselves but others. For the Iranian people, I was thinking about the comments right before us. Are we going to give them a path out to the freedom they want, or are we going to keep on making it so that it's harder? So I think these are really important conversations. I also think we ought to be having one on China and Taiwan, because these are hard, and we ought to have them in the way that we intend, although not in a partisan way, because I'm kind of anti-partisan on this stuff.
Reid?
I would just state as a matter of historical record that naval blockade has been understood as an act of war since Lincoln was throttling southern ports and the Supreme Court ruled in the prize cases. So I do think this is an ongoing conflict, and I do subscribe to the theory that it would be healthy for the Congress to debate, deliberate, decide how to better oversee the war, ultimately end it. I think to summon the wisdom from Jason Crow's remarks earlier, this is an important aspect of constitutional design, part of the wisdom of the Madisonian approach, and there's a reason it's Article 1, right? And I think it's the most solemn obligation of our elected officials, and I look forward to further debate, deliberation, and a vote.
In 2 weeks' time, President Trump will be in Beijing, China. He'll meet with President Xi. I'll be on that trip. I'm looking forward to it.
I'm so
And,
very jealous.
well, come along, Sue. You can come along. Let me ask you, to what extent each of you believe that China can play a role in bringing an end to this conflict? China has enormous influence on Iran. Can the president lean on President Xi? Can he ask President Xi, can you provide some pressure on the Iranian leadership to end this conflict? What's your view, Sue?
So two competing paths. Number one is different from Russia, but China views this world as a competitive moment where they can win, where they can change the world order to be more in their favor. So that's one. You can't underestimate kind of how firm they are on that. The other one is we are incredibly economically intertwined with them, which I have always believed gives us an opportunity to work with China on areas of mutual interest. The interesting rub, I think, is you now have two people that are coming at it from a very economic perspective. China's going to want to use it to their advantage to increase their competitive power and control over the world's economy. And President Trump is going to want to use the fact that we're economically intertwined to see if we can get a deal. So I'm hopeful, but man, this is a pretty serious moment of tension. So when you're there, just make sure we don't forget that they are independent and doctrinally want a superior position.
General McKenzie, I have to get your thoughts on this.
Sir, I would agree with Sue's position. I would just add, if you want China to play a role here, I think you have to increase pressure on China, and that means cutting off oil completely, which, as you know, is still, to some degree, is still flowing to China. Right. You've got to actually enforce existing sanctions, and you've got to do other things as well. If you want China to play a role here, that's what you've got to do. They will respond to that. They will not respond unless we increase pressure on them, in my judgment.
I think you're right.
And Reid, do you want to weigh in on that as well?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I profess no special expertise on Beijing's thinking about this. My presumption was that if Trump makes it to Beijing, they will want to talk primarily about the bilateral relationship and important considerations in their backyard. I think they don't want Trump to be distracted, perhaps, by circumstances unfolding in the Gulf. One could imagine that, to your point, John, Iran could be a useful agent if Trump decides he wants to declare victory and come home, if some other arrangement or accommodation needs to be made for better transit through the Strait. That's where they could certainly play something of a constructive role. It's interesting, Trump is peculiar on China, shall we say, inviting President Xi to the inauguration, clearly wants to commit to pageantry and summitry and some sort of reasonable modus vivendi, focusing the relation more on the economic and commercial domain, less on the kind of militarized or securitized question that I think has led the day for previous administrations, including his first. So yeah, we'll see what happens if it happens.
This is a high-stakes game of chicken when you think about it, in the sense that Iran thinks they can, as was pointed out just moments ago, they can wait it out, play the long game, puts pressure politically on the president, on Republicans. They want to hold on to the House and the Senate. And from President Trump's perspective, he believes that denying Iran tens of millions of dollars every day in oil revenue is going to force Iran to give in. What's your stake? Who's going to give in first? Who's going to blink first? Sue?
6,000-year-old country. Patient as all get out. Being in the intelligence community, we have long overstated the economic failure as evidence of imminent collapse. Boy, they're going to be hard, especially it's going to be hard to get them to give just because of all those things I said. Plus, man, they're having success. Weirdly, they have evoked some sympathy globally. I think they understand that this is a president that is our first real economic president in terms of thinking about it in those terms rather than political military. And I think they will come up with some way to increase that pressure, even though they have not the leverage they think they do because of everything that General McKenzie said. I think the pressure's on us.
General McKenzie, I have to get your view on this. Yeah.
Fix whatever I said.
So no, actually, as usual, you're spot on. I would add that, look, the primary goal of Iranian statecraft is regime preservation. Mm-hmm. They view themselves as a revolutionary regime. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't, but nonetheless, that's how they view themselves. And the primary task is to pass the revolution on to the next generation, export the regime, and keep the revolution pure. Mm-hmm. They will sacrifice everything to preserve the regime. Iran will respond if faced with existential pressure. Even a hard-right IRGC-led regime will respond if enough pressure is applied. We've seen this before. They did it drinking from the poison chalice in the late 1980s. When the Iraq War went bad, Khomeini drank from the poison chalice, signed a truce, a very adverse truce, in order to preserve the regime. I would argue you can apply enough pressure to Iran to get something that would be acceptable to us. You just got to be willing to apply that pressure.
Reid, do you buy into that point of view?
I can't disagree with the general. We certainly have the capability to apply awesome pressure to the regime. It comes down to a matter of political willpower, whether or not the president is willing to go bigger and harder, perhaps for longer as well, too. I wouldn't be able to state with high certainty whether or not the president will, in fact, apply that pressure. It's very difficult to predict. This war has gone longer than many might have predicted. I don't know what the temporal boundaries look like henceforth. But yeah, I would also foot stomp General McKenzie's point that the Iranian regime has a very, well, it's not a simple goal, but it's an obvious one, which is survival. And they are absolutely ruthless in pursuit of that goal. So we'll see where it goes, but it's a sticky wicket.
General, what has been learned about Iran over the course of the past 9 weeks? Learn from, you wear your hat as the former CENTCOM commander. Learn from what our adversaries are seeing in watching this conflict play itself out.
So the thing to remember about Iran is they're far better negotiators than fighters. They're not bad fighters, but they're brilliant negotiators. All right, a predecessor of mine at U.S. Central Command, Tony Zinni, used to say Iran never met a war they could win or a negotiation they could lose. And so they want to get to negotiations because they believe they can best us in that domain. But just very briefly, what we've learned is Iran's missiles have not performed as well as they thought they would. Their drones have performed pretty well. We're adapting to that, and that's just because of the massive, it's been talked about by other panels today, what happened in Ukraine, their ability to experiment in Ukraine with their Russian friends has given them some capabilities that we are now, I think, eventually going to be able to suppress as time goes forward. But they've been, operationally, They've performed a lot less well than I thought they would. In fact, if you had back in 2020, if I had run a simulation that posited, here's where we are at plus 45, I would have not accepted it because that was too good. You know, we lost an F-15. That's tragic. But, you know, the fact of the matter is, that's one aircraft in 30 days. Golly, not bad. So we should just remember these things as we talk about it. War is the province of chance, as Clausewitz said. And we need to recognize that. And sometimes you just have to screw your courage to the sticking point and get on with it.
General, Sue, Reid, thank you so much. We'll end it there. Thank you to all of you. Great. Good job, Sue.
Awesome.